The silence after that phone call stretched longer than any deployment I'd ever endured. I stood there in my kitchen, still holding the receiver, watching steam rise from my untouched coffee mug, while those words echoed in my head like sonar pings in dark water. "We found something inside your grandfather's car. You need to come now." My hands were shaking. Not the kind of tremor you get from too much caffeine, but the deep bone shake that comes when your world tilts sideways and gravity stops making sense. That car had been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since I'd walked into what used to be Grandpa's garage and found nothing but oil stains on concrete and the ghost outline of tire tracks where his pride and joy once sat. 3 weeks since my father looked me dead in the eye and said he'd sold it like he was discussing the weather forecast. But now someone from a dealership I'd never heard of was telling me there was something inside that car, something important enough to track down my phone number and call on a Tuesday morning when most people are worrying about grocery lists and traffic reports, something that belonged to me. I set the phone down with the kind of care you use when handling unexploded ordnance. My reflection stared back at me from the kitchen window, still wearing yesterday's uniform because I hadn't been sleeping much lately. Dark circles under eyes that had seen too much, shoulders that carried weight most people never have to lift. But right now I looked like what I was, a granddaughter who'd been betrayed by her own blood. The morning light caught the edge of my grandfather's dog tags hanging around my neck. He'd given them to me the day before he passed, pressing the warm metal into my palm with fingers that had once steadied artillery pieces and changed 1,000 tires on Navy transport trucks. His voice was barely a whisper then, but his words cut through the hospital noise like a blade through silk. "These belong to someone who understands what service means," he'd said. "Don't let anyone tell you they're just metal." I touched those tags now, feeling the worn edges where his thumb had rubbed during long watches and longer deployments. John William Hayes, USN, blood type, service number, and everything that mattered carved into steel that would outlast flesh and bone in memory. The car had been his cathedral. A 1968 Navy staff vehicle painted that particular shade of blue that looks black until sunlight hits it just right. Chrome that gleamed like mirror glass, leather seats that smelled of salt air, and Old Spice aftershave. Every Sunday after church, he'd fire up that engine with the kind of reverence other people reserved for prayer, and we'd drive the coast road with the windows down, and his stories filling the space between us. He'd tell me about the men who served under him, not the heroes from movies, but the real ones who showed up every day and did their jobs without fanfare or recognition. The kid from Oklahoma who could fix any engine blindfolded. The chief petty officer who wrote letters home for sailors who couldn't spell their own names right. The cook who somehow made decent meals from canned mystery meat and pure determination. "Your worth isn't measured by the noise you make," he'd say, one weathered hand steady on the wheel while the other gestured toward the horizon. "It's measured by what you do when nobody's watching." Those Sunday drives were my classroom, and that car was where I learned everything that mattered about honor, duty, and what it meant to wear the uniform. It was where he taught me to salute properly, not with the sloppy wave most civilians think passes for respect, but with the crisp precision that says you understand the weight of what you're acknowledging. It was where he explained why you never leave a shipmate behind, why you stand when the flag passes, why some things are worth more than money. It was where he made me promise to carry forward what he'd spent a lifetime building. And my father had sold it to pay for my brother's wedding, not to pay bills or cover medical expenses or keep food on the table, to fund a party, to impress people who measured worth in crystal stemware and flower arrangements that would wilt before the honeymoon ended, to buy his way into a family that judged success by the weight of your wallet instead of the strength of your character. I'd found out by accident, walking into that empty garage looking for a wrench to fix my kitchen faucet. The space where Grandpa's car had lived for 35 years was just concrete now, swept clean like evidence of a crime scene. When I asked where it was, Dad shrugged like he was explaining why he'd thrown out old newspapers. "Your brother needs money for the wedding," he'd said. "That thing was just taking up space. Just taking up space. Like 35 years of military service was clutter. Like the stories and the memories and the promise I'd made to a dying man were garage sale items priced to move. I'd stood there staring at those tire tracks, feeling something inside me crack like ice on a frozen lake. Not break completely, not yet, but develop those hairline fractures that spread until the whole structure gives way. My father kept talking, something about market value and practical decisions, but his words turned into white noise against the roar of betrayal in my ears. The worst part wasn't the money, though that stung plenty. It was the casual dismissal, the way he'd erased Grandpa's legacy with a signature on a bill of sale. Like honor was a commodity you could liquidate when times got tight. But now someone was calling me about something inside that car, something important enough to track me down and ask me to come immediately. My mind raced through possibilities, each one sparking hope and dread in equal measure. Maybe Grandpa had left something behind, some final message or memento that my father had missed in his rush to convert memories into cash. Or maybe it was nothing. Maybe some dealer was trying to squeeze more money out of a transaction that had already cost me everything that mattered. I looked at the clock on my microwave. 08:30 hours. If I left now, I could make it to wherever this Harbor View auto place was and still have time to process whatever I found there before my shift started. The logical part of my brain, the part trained by years of military discipline, said I should call first. Get more information. Understand what I was walking into before I walked into it. But the granddaughter in me, the little girl who'd learned about courage in the passenger seat of a Navy staff car, said some things were too important for phone calls. Some things required showing up in person, standing straight, and facing whatever came next with the kind of dignity Grandpa had spent a lifetime teaching me. I grabbed my keys, checked my uniform in the hallway mirror, and headed for the door. Whatever was waiting for me at that dealership, whatever final surprise my grandfather had left behind, I was going to face it the way he'd taught me to face everything. Head up, shoulders back, ready for whatever storm was coming. Because honor doesn't make appointments. It just shows up when you need it most. The drive across town felt like navigating through a minefield of memories. Every street corner held some ghost of the past, some echo of the man who'd shaped me into someone worth saluting. I passed the diner where he'd taken me for pancakes every birthday, the park where he'd taught me to throw a proper spiral, the church where we'd sat in the same pew every Sunday for 20 years. At each red light, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the black leather. My grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the passenger seat, steady and sure as always. Easy there, sailor. Keep your heading true. Harbor View Auto sat on the corner of Maritime Drive like a weathered sentry keeping watch over the harbor. The building itself was nothing special. Just cinder blocks painted white with rust stains bleeding through where the salt air had worked its slow magic. A chain-link fence surrounded a lot filled with vehicles in various stages of surrender to time and neglect. But there, parked near the office door like a jewel among pebbles, sat Grandpa's car. My breath caught in my throat. Even under a thin layer of dust, that steel blue paint gleamed with the kind of depth that only comes from decades of careful attention. The chrome bumpers reflected the morning sky, and those white wall tires still held their perfect roundness despite everything. It looked exactly as it had the last time I'd seen it, proud and patient, waiting for someone who understood what it represented. A man in coveralls emerged from the office before I'd even killed my engine. He was maybe 50, with grease under his fingernails, and the kind of direct gaze that comes from years of dealing with people's mechanical problems. His name tag read Danny, and when he saw my uniform, his posture straightened just enough to show respect without making a show of it. "Ma'am," he said, extending a work-hardened hand. "Danny Kowalski. I'm the one who called. Appreciate you coming down so quick." The handshake was firm, honest. The kind that said this man had learned to judge character by grip strength and eye contact, rather than bank statements and business cards. I liked him immediately. "I'm Commander Hayes. I said. "That's my grandfather's car." He nodded toward the vehicle with something approaching reverence. "Beautiful machine. Your grandfather, he knew how to take care of things, didn't he? Built to last, maintained to perfection. They don't make them like this anymore." "No, sir, they don't." I kept my voice steady, professional, but inside I was fighting a war between hope and heartbreak. "What did you find inside?" Danny's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, maybe we should sit down for this. There's coffee in the office, and what I got to show you, well, it's going to take some explaining. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town auto dealer. Mismatched furniture, a coffee pot that had seen better decades, and walls covered with calendars featuring chrome and curves from Detroit's golden age. But it was clean, organized, and honest. No slick sales pitches or fancy displays, just a place where working people came to solve transportation problems with dignity intact." Danny poured 2 cups of coffee that could have stripped paint, then settled behind a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a naval vessel. The wood was scarred but solid, the kind of furniture that outlasts the people who use it. "Your father brought that car in 3 weeks ago," he began. "Said he needed to sell it quick for family reasons. Now, I've been in this business 30 years, and I can usually tell when someone's selling something they don't want to let go of. But your father, he seemed eager enough. Paperwork looked clean. Title was clear." I felt my jaw tighten. The betrayal was still fresh, still sharp enough to cut. "What changed your mind?" Danny reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with documents. "Yesterday morning, I was doing the detail work, getting her ready for the lot. That's when I found this wedged between the driver's seat and the center console." He slid the envelope across the desk. My name was written on the front in Grandpa's careful block lettering, the same handwriting that had addressed birthday cards and Christmas packages for 30 years. Below my name, in smaller letters, were the words, "For emergencies only." My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, official-looking, with the weight that comes from documents that matter. Inside were 3 items: a letter, a small brass key I'd never seen before, and what looked like a military service record with sections blacked out in heavy ink. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Grandpa passed away. His handwriting was shakier than usual, but the words were clear, deliberate, chosen with the precision of a man who knew his time was running short. "Princess," it began, using the nickname he'd called me since I was old enough to salute. "If you're reading this, then someone has made a mistake that needs fixing. The car was never meant to leave the family. It carries more than memories." I looked up at Danny, who was watching me with the patient expression of someone who'd seen enough family drama to know when to stay quiet and let people process. He gestured for me to continue reading. "That key opens something important. Something I should have shown you years ago but didn't because I thought there would be more time. There's always supposed to be more time, isn't there? Check behind the spare tire. What you find there belongs to you now, along with the responsibility that comes with it." My heart was hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Behind the spare tire meant the trunk, which meant Grandpa had hidden something in that car, something important enough to leave detailed instructions for finding it. "The Navy doesn't abandon its own," the letter continued. "Even after the uniform comes off, even after the last salute is given, we look out for each other. What you'll find is proof of that promise. Use it wisely." It was signed with his full name and rank, the way he'd signed every official document in 35 years of service. "Command Master Chief John William Hayes, USN, retired." Danny cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, I took the liberty of checking that spare tire compartment after I found the letter. Figured if your grandfather went to the trouble of hiding something, it was probably important. What I found there, well, it's not my business to judge, but it's definitely something that should stay in the family." He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, returning with a metal lockbox about the size of a briefcase. The surface was scratched and dented, bearing the scars of decades of careful handling. A small brass lock held it closed, and I knew without looking that the key in my hand would fit perfectly. "Your grandfather was a careful man," Danny said. "Whatever's in there, he meant for you to have it. Your father never even looked in the trunk, just signed the papers and left. Probably figured an old car was just an old car." I turned the key in the lock and it opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the small office. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were documents, photographs, and what looked like official correspondence dating back decades. On top was another letter, this one addressed to whoever might find the box. "The Navy Relief Fund," it began, "is an unofficial network of retired personnel who provide assistance to veterans and their families in times of crisis. This record documents aid provided between 1975 and 2010, including recipients, amounts, and follow-up status. These files are maintained for historical purposes and to ensure continued support where needed." I lifted the first bundle of papers, revealing photographs of families, letters of thanks, and what appeared to be financial records showing small loans and gifts distributed over the course of 35 years. Each entry was meticulously documented in Grandpa's careful handwriting, with notes about follow-up visits and ongoing needs. Danny whistled softly. "Your grandfather was running his own private relief operation, using that car to deliver help where it was needed most." One photograph caught my attention. It showed a young woman in a Navy uniform standing beside a small house with a for sale sign in the yard. On the back, in Grandpa's handwriting, "Sarah Martinez, widowed at 23, 3 children, helped secure housing loan, September 1987. Follow-up, graduated nursing school, 1991. Another showed an older man in work clothes standing beside what looked like a newly opened auto repair shop. The note read, "Tommy Chen, disabled veteran, startup loan for business, March 1995. Paid forward to 2 other veterans by 2000. Page after page of quiet heroism of a man who'd turned retirement into a second career of service. No fanfare, no recognition, just one veteran helping others navigate the challenges that came after the uniform was hung up for the last time." The final item in the box was a small notebook, its pages filled with addresses, phone numbers, and brief status updates. "Active cases," Grandpa had labeled it. People still needing help, still counting on someone to remember that service doesn't end when the paycheck stops. I looked up at Danny, who was refilling his coffee cup with the deliberate movements of a man giving someone space to process overwhelming information. "This is why he never talked about what he did after retirement," I said. "He was still serving." "Looks that way," Danny agreed, "and from the looks of those records, he was damn good at it." "Question is, what happens now?" I closed the notebook and looked at the brass key still warm in my palm. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a familiar uniform, heavy but not unwelcome. Grandpa had left me more than a car. He'd left me a mission. The morning sun slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows across the documents spread before me. Outside, I could hear the harbor sounds that had provided the soundtrack to my grandfather's retirement years. Seagulls calling, boat engines puttering, the distant clang of rigging against masts. The sounds of home, of duty, of promises kept even when no one was watching. I stood up, gathering the papers and photographs with the same care Grandpa would have used. "This car isn't going anywhere," I said, "not until I figure out how to honor what he built." Danny nodded slowly, the kind of understanding that passes between people who recognize duty when they see it. "Ma'am," he said, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care, "there's something else you should know. The man who was supposed to buy this car, he's been calling every day since we postponed the sale, getting pretty insistent about it." My spine straightened. What kind of insistent? The kind that makes me glad I keep the gates locked at night. Danny's expression darkened. "Says he's got plans for the vehicle, wants to add it to some private collection. Offered to pay double what your father was asking. No questions asked about the delay." That sent ice through my veins. A collector willing to pay double without seeing the car again, without asking why the sale had been held up. That wasn't enthusiasm. That was desperation. And desperate buyers usually knew something sellers didn't. Did he say what kind of collection? Military vehicles, according to him. Says he's got a museum down in Florida. Specializes in Navy history. But when I asked for references, documentation, anything official, he got real quiet real fast. I felt the familiar weight of my grandfather's dog tags against my chest, warm metal that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. Everything about this situation felt wrong, like puzzle pieces that had been forced together by someone who didn't care if the picture made sense. What's his name? Marcus Webb. Says he's former Navy, but something about the way he talks doesn't sit right. Uses all the right words, knows the terminology, but it feels rehearsed, like someone who learned Navy speak from books instead of birthing compartments. I made a mental note to run that name through some channels when I got back to base. If Webb was former Navy, there would be records. And if he wasn't, that opened up a whole different set of questions about why he wanted Grandpa's car so badly. Danny walked over to the window, pulling back the faded curtain to peer out at the lot. Your grandfather's car has been drawing attention since we put it out there. Folks stopping by just to look, asking questions about the history. One old-timer said he remembered seeing your grandfather driving it around town, always with someone in the passenger seat who looked like they needed a friend. That sounded exactly right. Grandpa had never been one for empty gestures or showy charity. He found people who needed help and helped them, quietly, without fanfare or recognition. The kind of service that didn't make headlines, but changed lives one conversation at a time. I need to get back out there and look at everything again, I said. There might be more hidden compartments, more records. If Grandpa was running an operation this extensive, he would have kept detailed files. Danny grabbed a ring of keys from his desk drawer. Take all the time you need. I'll keep the lot locked and make sure nobody bothers you. And ma'am, if that Webb character shows up again, I'll call the police before I call you. The afternoon sun was higher now, burning off the morning haze and turning the harbor into a sheet of hammered silver. I walked around the car slowly, seeing it not just as a vehicle but as a mobile command post, a rolling headquarters for 3 decades of quiet missions. The trunk revealed more secrets once I knew where to look. Beneath the spare tire was a second compartment, professionally installed and nearly invisible unless you knew it was there. Inside were more files, these ones organized by year and marked with a simple coding system. Each folder contained case studies, follow-up reports, and photographs documenting the long-term impact of Grandpa's interventions. One file from 1983 showed a teenage boy standing beside a newly repaired motorcycle. The notes indicated the boy had been headed for trouble, skipping school, running with the wrong crowd. Grandpa had hired him to help with odd jobs, taught him basic mechanics, and eventually helped him get accepted into a technical college. The follow-up photos showed the same young man in a Navy uniform, then later in civilian clothes standing beside his own auto repair shop, with a sign that read, Honest work, fair prices. Another folder contained letters from a widow whose husband had died in a training accident. Grandpa had not only helped with immediate expenses but had stayed in touch for years, documenting the family's progress as the children grew up and found their own paths. The most recent letter, dated just 6 months before Grandpa's death, included a photo of the woman's daughter graduating from the Naval Academy. Page after page of quiet victories, of lives redirected and futures secured through the simple act of one person caring enough to show up. No government funding, no official oversight, just a retired sailor who understood that the mission never really ends. But it was the final folder that made my hands shake. This one was marked ongoing and contained active cases, people who were still receiving help, still counting on someone to remember their needs. A disabled veteran struggling with medical bills, a young mother whose military husband had been deployed for 8 months straight, an elderly couple facing foreclosure because their son's military benefits had been delayed by bureaucratic red tape. Each file contained detailed notes about monthly assistance, upcoming needs, and long-term goals. At the bottom of each folder was a small envelope marked Emergency Fund, with cash amounts noted in Grandpa's careful handwriting. The dates showed that he had been updating these files right up until his final hospital stay. I sat back on my heels, overwhelmed by the scope of what I was seeing. This wasn't just charity. This was a systematic professional operation run with military precision and funded entirely by one man's retirement savings and Social Security checks. Grandpa had turned his golden years into a second career of service, using his car as a mobile office, and his reputation as currency to help people who had nowhere else to turn. My phone buzzed with a text message. The number wasn't one I recognized, but the words made my blood run cold. Still interested in selling that Navy car. My offer stands. Time-sensitive opportunity. I showed the message to Danny, who frowned as he read it. "That's not the number Webb gave me," he said. "Looks like word is getting around about your grandfather's car. Question is, how did they get your phone number?" That was a very good question, and one that suggested this situation was more complicated than a simple car sale gone wrong. Someone had done research, made connections, and was now applying pressure. The kind of pressure that came from wanting something badly enough to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. I scrolled through the rest of the phone, looking for other messages or missed calls. Nothing obvious, but the fact that someone had tracked down my personal number meant they had resources, connections, and probably a very specific reason for wanting Grandpa's car. Another text arrived as I was thinking, "Car contains items of historical significance. Willing to negotiate for complete package. Discretion assured." Historical significance. That phrase sent warning bells clanging in my head like a general quarters alarm. Someone knew about the hidden compartments, the files, the decades of documentation that Grandpa had accumulated. They weren't just buying a classic car. They were buying silence. Danny was reading over my shoulder, his expression growing darker with each word. "Ma'am, this is starting to feel less like a car sale and more like something else entirely. Maybe we should call the police." "Not yet," I said. "But soon. First, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." I spent the next hour photographing every document, every letter, every piece of evidence that showed the scope of Grandpa's private relief operation. If someone was trying to buy this material, I needed to know why. And if they were willing to pressure a military officer to get it, I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The sun was beginning to set over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of deployment sunsets in distant waters. I had always found comfort in those moments of transition, when day surrendered to night and the watch changed hands. There was something reassuring about the continuity, the knowledge that someone was always standing guard, always ready to meet whatever darkness might bring. But as I loaded the last of Grandpa's files into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this particular sunset was marking the end of more than just a day. The simple grief of losing a grandfather was evolving into something more complex, more dangerous. Someone out there wanted these records badly enough to track me down, and I was beginning to understand that my family's betrayal was just the opening move in a much larger game. My phone rang as I was securing the lockbox in my trunk. The caller ID showed the same number that had sent the threatening texts. I let it go to voicemail, then played back the message with Danny listening beside me. The voice was smooth, professional, with just enough of a military cadence to sound authentic. "Commander Hayes, this is Marcus Webb. I understand there's been some confusion about the vehicle purchase. I'd like to meet in person to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. I think you'll find my offer very generous and very private. I'll be at the Harbor View Inn tonight if you'd like to talk." Danny shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, that man has done his homework. Knows your rank, knows where you are, probably knows a lot more than that. This isn't feeling like a coincidence anymore." I agreed completely. Someone had been watching, waiting, preparing for exactly this moment. The question was whether they had been planning to intercept the car before I found the hidden files, or whether my discovery had forced them to accelerate their timeline. Either way, I wasn't going to let 35 years of my grandfather's service disappear into someone else's private collection. The files represented more than historical documents. They were proof of a promise kept, evidence of the kind of quiet heroism that never made headlines, but changed lives one person at a time. The mission Grandpa had left me was becoming clearer with each passing hour. It wasn't just about preserving his legacy or protecting the people he had helped. It was about understanding that some things were worth more than money, more than convenience, more than keeping peace in a family that had already forgotten what peace was supposed to look like. I looked out at the harbor one more time, watching the lights of distant ships appear like stars against the darkening water. Somewhere out there, sailors were standing watch, keeping their ships safe, maintaining the vigilance that made everything else possible. It was an honor I understood, a responsibility I had sworn to uphold. Tomorrow, I would have to make some difficult decisions about Marcus Webb and his generous offers. Tonight I had work to do, files to study, and a promise to keep to a man who had never broken his word in 78 years of living. The fight for Grandpa's legacy was just beginning, and I intended to win it the way he would have wanted. With honor, with precision, and with the kind of quiet determination that moved mountains one stone at a time. At a time. The Harbor View Inn sat like a weathered sentinel overlooking the bay, its Victorian bones dressed in fresh paint that couldn't quite hide the salt stains creeping up from the foundation. I parked across the street under a flickering streetlight, watching shadows move behind curtained windows. The lobby glowed warm yellow against the gathering dusk, and through the glass doors I could see a figure in a dark suit, pacing near the front desk. Marcus Webb, I presumed. Even from this distance, something about his posture felt wrong. Too straight, too deliberate, like someone performing military bearing rather than living it. Real Navy walks with a rolling gait that comes from years of adjusting to deck movement. This man moved like he'd learned military posture from a manual. My phone buzzed with another message. "I can see you across the street. Why don't you come in? Coffee's getting cold." That sent ice through my veins. He wasn't just waiting inside. He was watching, tracking my movements, demonstrating the kind of surveillance awareness that suggested serious backing. This wasn't some casual collector trying to acquire a vintage vehicle. This was someone with resources, training, and a very specific agenda. I texted back, "Prefer neutral ground. Diner on Maritime in 20 minutes. The response came immediately. "Understandable caution. See you there." The fact that he agreed so quickly told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't worried about being seen in public, which meant he was confident in whatever cover story he'd prepared. That confidence worried me more than threats would have. I drove the long way to the diner, taking side streets and doubling back twice to check for tails. Old habits from deployment zones where paranoia kept you breathing. The streets were mostly empty, just a few locals heading home from late shifts and teenagers cruising the harbor loop with music thumping from open windows. Margie's all-night diner occupied the corner of Maritime and First, like it had been there since the harbor was dug. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they'd been embalmed. The coffee was strong enough to dissolve paint, and the pie came with judgmental looks if you didn't finish every crumb. I chose a booth with clear sightlines to both entrances and the kitchen, positioning myself so the light fell on whoever I was talking to while keeping my own face in shadow. Basic interrogation setup, though I doubted Webb would recognize the tactical positioning. He arrived exactly on time, moving through the door with that same manufactured precision I'd observed from across the street. Medium height, silver haircut regulation short, wearing a suit that cost more than most sailors made in a month. His handshake was firm but calculated, the grip of someone who'd practiced projecting confidence without actually feeling it. "Commander Hayes," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice. I know this situation must be overwhelming." His voice carried just enough of a southern drawl to sound authentic, but the word choices were too careful, too rehearsed. Real Navy talked in contractions and shortcuts, the verbal equivalent of reef knots. This man spoke like he was reading from a script. I ordered coffee and waited for him to make the first move. In my experience, People with hidden agendas couldn't stand silence. They filled it with information they hadn't meant to share. I understand there's been some confusion about your grandfather's vehicle, he began, stirring sugar into coffee he hadn't tasted. My organization specializes in preserving naval history. We have facilities, resources, the ability to properly maintain and display artifacts of significance. What organization would that be? I asked. The Maritime Heritage Foundation. We're based in Pensacola with satellite facilities throughout the Gulf Coast. Private funding, but we work closely with the Navy Historical Center. I made a mental note to check that story the moment I got back to my car. If the Maritime Heritage Foundation existed, there would be records, documentation, a paper trail that led somewhere legitimate. If it didn't, then Marcus Webb was operating under false pretenses, which opened up questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. You seem very interested in one particular car, I said. Most collectors would have moved on by now, found something else to add to their museum. His smile was practiced, empty. Your grandfather's vehicle isn't just any car, Commander. It's a 1968 Navy staff vehicle with provenance, documentation, and what I suspect are some very interesting modifications. That last word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Modifications. He knew about the hidden compartments, the secret files, the 35 years of documentation that Grandpa had accumulated. The question was how he knew and what he planned to do with that knowledge. What kind of modifications? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. The kind that might contain historical materials, documents, photographs, perhaps correspondence between veterans. The sort of thing that could be valuable to researchers, historians, people who study the informal networks that developed after Vietnam. There it was. He wasn't interested in the car at all. He wanted the files, the records, the evidence of Grandpa's private relief operation. But why? What was in those documents that made them worth this kind of pressure, this level of surveillance and manipulation? I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, I said. It's just a car my grandfather kept in pristine condition. Sentimental value to the family, but nothing that would interest historians. Webb's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. The kind of calculation that came from years of reading people, evaluating threats, determining how much pressure to apply before something broke. Sometimes the truth has to be earned in pieces, fought for one document at a time. That night at the diner taught me that honor isn't something you inherit or display in a museum. It's something you live, something you protect, something you pass down through actions rather than artifacts. My grandfather's real legacy wasn't hidden in secret compartments or coded files. It was in the choice he made every day to show up for people who had no one else standing watch. Webb never got those files, by the way. They found their way to the people who needed them most, just like Grandpa would have wanted. Because some things are worth more than any collector's offer. Some things you don't sell. You carry them forward.